Hey, welcome back everyone to Maine School of Arts. I sure appreciate you guys being here today as we continue to learn about the different techniques that make up different types of artwork. Today we are going to be looking at a technique that artisans have been using for centuries, and they use it to suggest distance in their paintings and their drawings. This technique is known as atmospheric perspective. It can also be referred to as aerial perspective. So what is atmospheric perspective? Well, atmospheric perspective is the effect our atmosphere has on an object as it moves into the distance. Our atmosphere is filled with all kinds of tiny little particles. We usually can't see them with the naked eye, but they're there nonetheless. These particles may include vapor, smog, smoke, dust, or fog. Even on the clearest of days, these particles are in the air. Although we can't see these particles, we can see their effects on an object as it fades away into the distance. There's 5 things that typically happen. Number 1, the objects appear to get smaller. Number 2, they appear to get lighter in color. Number 3, the details tend to disappear. Number 4, the contrast is reduced. And last but not least, number 5, the colors are neutralized. Let's take a look at some photos so that you can see this in real life, and then we'll head down to the studio to see if we can recreate some of these effects. All right, let's take a look at this photo so we can take a look at those 5 things and how it works in real life. The first thing that we said was that items appear to get smaller. So when we take a look at these trees right here, these pine trees right here, and they're in the foreground, and this kind of gives us an idea of what the actual size of these trees are. Okay, but as they start to go further and further into the distance, you can see that they appear to get smaller and smaller. The second thing that happens is they appear to get lighter. So here, because these trees are in the foreground and these here are kind of like in the middle ground, we can still see quite a bit of detail and the colors are nice and bright. But as the trees start to go further and further into the distance, you can see that they start to become lighter. So the ones that are back here are so light that they almost blend into the grass itself. Details tend to disappear. So these trees are nice and close to us right here, so we can see everything. We can see the highlights, the shadows, the bark, the needles, everything. But these back here, because they're starting to get further and further away, we see less and less of the details. So like we know that these are the trunks, but we can't really see like the bark, for example. The contrast is reduced. So the further the things go back into the distance, the less contrast you have. And contrast is like how much difference there is between the object and the background. So like in these right here, we can see how much contrast we have between this trunk and the sky. But when we look at the trees that are back here, we don't see as much contrast. They're starting to blend into their surroundings, like so. And the last thing we said was that the colors are neutralized and may even take on a bluish cast. So that's clear to see. So here, these colors and these colors are nice and bright, and then here they're starting to get a little lighter, a little less bright. Then back here, they don't even look like a pure green anymore, right? They're being neutralized. And then way, way, way back here in the far, far distance, we can see how they're starting to take on that blue cast that we talked about. So this photograph is a real good example of what atmospheric perspective looks like in real life. Sometimes the particles in the air are a little bit more concentrated, so the effects will take place a little bit sooner. So for example, this photograph that I took just outside my backyard is on a nice clear day, and you can see the colors are nice and bright. We can see nice clear contrast. We can see far into the distance where these mountains are starting to take on a little bit of a blue cast. Here is a picture taken of the same place, pretty much from the same location, a few months later, and you can see that we had a little bit of fog coming in and everything changed. So this tree here stays, because it's close to us, you can still see quite a bit of contrast between it and the sky. But look how much quicker the contrast gets lost. Okay, Where here, you can still see nice contrast on these trees back here. Here, not so much. And as they go further and further away, they feel like they're just fading into the mist. And the fog was thick enough where we can't even see the mountains anymore. So this is an example of atmospheric perspective when you have a greater number or a greater concentration of particles in the air. All right, so let's head on down to the studio and see if we can recreate some of these effects. All right, here we are back in the studio, and what I want to show you here, what I want to kind of give you some tips on how to create that atmospheric perspective. Okay, and there's 5 things that we need to take into consideration. The first thing is size. Just like in linear perspective, things need to get smaller as they go further into the distance. So you can see here, hopefully you can see it in the drawing, I've already started to adjust the sizes of the rest of these bald cypresses as they go further into the distance. The second thing that we need to worry about is lightness. This tree is in the foreground, so we can see highlights and shadows and details and everything, but as they go further back, we need to start making the trees lighter. So when I get ready to paint this guy here, which is the next one back, I need to overall make it a little bit lighter than this one. I also need to make sure that those details start to disappear a little bit. As they go further and further into the background, the details will kind of start to blend together, and you won't see them as easily as you do as something that is up close. So let's take a look at this little tree right here, and then we'll talk about the rest of them. So what I've done is something that I usually don't do, and I've pre-mixed different values. So here we have nothing, just pure plain water, then a light gray, medium gray, dark gray, really dark, and then pure black. Okay. And when we start going back into the distance, we want to work in this direction. We want to let it get lighter and lighter and lighter. Okay. So I'm going to put this on top of this for a minute just so to protect it, but I know that this tree is further back, so I got to make sure that it's a little bit lighter overall than the one in the foreground. So let's go ahead and do that. Just coming in with some clean water. Just to wet the section that I'm going to be working on. And I'm going to start off extra light. I can always darken it. So this is my light one. So I'm going to start here and see if it's dark enough. And I think that that's not going to be dark enough. So I'm just going to move over one. And there we go. Go a little bit darker. Oops. And because it's starting to go further back into the distance, the details are not going to be that strong. So I'm going to go a little bit darker. I know that my light source, I should have told you that, is coming from my left. That's why I've already made that decision. So I'm going to go ahead and put in a little bit of a shadow on this side of this tree here. And I'm going to allow some of this to suggest some of the bark, but I'm not going to do much more than that, right? Because this tree is not as close. Once it dries, I may go back in and just kind of like touch it up a little bit, but not a ton. Even this area here where the roots go into the water, typically they get really dark, but since it's going a little bit further away, your shadows won't be as dark either. So it's not just your highlights. You got to really think about your shadows as well. And I'm trying to keep the edges a little bit softer. I don't want like really strong outlines, right? Because that's where that contrast comes in. So I'm trying to be careful not to make it too pronounced as it goes back into the distance. So like I can show this coming in to the bark once it dries a little bit, but I don't want to make it like it's super close to us. So I'm going to add just a tiny bit more shadows on this side. Let's go a little stronger since the paper is wet. as I'm putting in the shadow, I'm also suggesting a little bit of the bark. And the bark on these trees is a little bit on the rough side, and they tend to peel on these bold cypress. So they're not silky smooth like you would find, like say on an aspen or something like that. But again, because this is far away, I do not need to show too much of that. Let's bring this in just a little bit. Oops, that's too much. So there's the danger. So because this paper is a little bit wet, this little section, I'm going to try to take some of this off. But this shadow would have been too dark for this tree that's going into the distance. So remember, lighten up your shadows and soften up your highlights. Okay. Get a little separation between this, I guess you can call them a foot, and then there's another one here. So I'm going to add just the tiniest bit of a shadow here, just to separate them a little bit. And the same thing here, but nowhere near as dominant as the one in the foreground. So let's take a look at the difference. So on this side, you can see that because this tree is nice and close to us, that it's okay for me to add all of these little details and highlights and shadows and branches and all of that. But as it starts to move back into the distance, we need to start to, diffuse that. So yes, here I do have some shadows, and I do have a little bit of where you can see the branches going into the main trunk, but that's it. I don't want to do much more than that. After I'm done with everything, if I feel like it's not enough, I can always tweak it. Okay. All right, so let's move on to this one right here. This one is starting to go even further. So the further that we go back, now not only do we have to worry about making it lighter, but we also have to start reducing the contrast even more. And remember that contrast is the difference between two objects, right? So I don't want to see a clean edge here like I do here, okay? And I need to make this lighter than this. So let's see what that looks like. Put this here. The easiest way I find to do that is always to wet the area with just clean water. So that allows me to diffuse this little edge right here. So you can see that it's nowhere near as tall, nowhere near as wide, and the base is up higher. So all of these things tell me that this tree is further back. And now I'm just going over this a little bit just to make sure that the edges are soft. When I'm done, I'll erase the pencil lines before I do the water. So there might be, since this one is not like super far, there might be a light shadow on the right side, but the shadow has to be lighter than this one as well. And if I add any branches here, same thing, they have to be nice and light. If I add any leaves or anything, they have to be light as well. So it'll start to look something like that. And you just keep doing that. The further back you go, the lighter, the less contrast you want to add. And if you were working with colors, you would also have to neutralize the colors because they just wouldn't be as bright as they go further and further back into the distance. All right, so let's move on to these two right here. They're similar. And then these will be further, these are the furthest ones away. So those will be like almost non-existent. So just like before, I'm going to take clean water and I'm just going to wet this area
And now I need to go to one of my lighter values. So probably this one here. And put this in right here. Now that's a little bit too light. That's probably good for the ones that are going to be way back there. So I'm going to go ahead, wipe my brush, take a little bit of this off. And actually, as I look at it, this one is lighter than that, so I'm actually good. I think I'm going to leave that. Okay. So let's go ahead and do the other one here as well. And it's not just the objects. Like in this case, we're working with trees. But when I get ready to start working on the water and on any moths or anything that I want to add, I have to think of that as well, right? So it's not just the main objects and then you don't mess with the background. You have to adjust the background as well. Or the setting, I should say. You have to adjust the setting as well. And like I said, when it dries, I need to get rid of these outlines because I don't want to see, the outlines create a kind of a contrast, and I don't want to see that. I want to see the representation of the tree, but without a clear outline defining the tree from the background. And then these guys back here are so far away that I'm just barely going to put anything on them whatsoever. They may not even show up that well on the camera because they're that far away. They feel like they're blending right into the background. So they're very small in size and they're very light. And down here where they go into the water, into the swamp, you probably won't even see that much of them at all. Okay. All right. So already, let's see if we can take a look at it. Look at it from a different angle. There we go. So you could see clearly how these trees are changing as they go further into the distance. So when you're trying to create the illusion of atmospheric perspective or aerial perspective in your drawing, keep these 5 things in mind. Number 1, make the objects appear smaller. Okay, and that's just a basic rule of perspective. Number 2, have them start to get lighter as they go further back into the distance. Number 3, start getting rid of your details or merging them together so they're not as defined. Number 4, start reducing the contrast between your objects and your background. And last but not least, if you are working with color, neutralize your colors a little bit so that they're not as bright as colors that are in the foreground. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and continue working on this a little bit, and then I'll bring it back when it's all done. Hopefully the tips that I've given you here will help you. So the next time that you are trying to create the sense of atmosphere in your paintings or in your drawings, make sure to include aerial perspective. Okay, it's not just about the drawing, but it's also about the effects. So, all right, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.